Hello, gentle reader. Here we are, another wonderful episode of Everything is Everything, and this will fulfill a promise that has been made. Okay, Amit has repeatedly promised an episode on the great fog of terms and labels that are used in the modern world. Okay, we are all confused around what's a liberal, what's a conservative, what's a leftist, what's a rightist, what's a patriot, what's a nationalist. Okay, there is this fog of words, and these words have interacted with modern tribalism. We don't want any of you to be tribal, but these words are used in the world, and I think it would be good for all of us to just go dive into these words and their history and get a better sense of what they used to mean in the 18th century and what they mean today and how they are hurled around as epithets today. And once again, please don't ever use these words as an epithet, but we have to understand this world. So, Amit has developed a beautiful storyline today where he's going to guide us through all this. Let's go.
You know, and there is one way in which you are like a socialist, which is that you promise a lot and I'm worried if you can deliver, right? So we have built this episode, lots of conversation has led to this. And actually, I'm glad that there was a kind of public demand for this episode that there was, because people like us often commit the curse of knowledge. We think कि हाँ हमें पता है ये label ये है ये label वो है. We might have a sense of the history behind what certain words mean, and we think everybody knows. So we throw these labels around in conversation, and actually they are very woolly and they mean different things to different people. And to have a meaningful conversation, it's important to be clear about them. So that is our effort in today's episode. Gentle readers, we're looking at like a table of contents here, sort of the different terms that we will cover and try to demystify, and we will try and do it in a neutral way. Obviously, we identify with some of these terms more than others, but actually in our everyday lives, we don't use any of them now because labels are dangerous for reasons that we will come to. So this is sort of our humble effort at, showing what it is that we mean when we use these words. So I want to start by clarifying three important points about the labels that we're going to talk about today. And one of them is that we should not get confused between the proper noun and the common noun. We discussed this in our episode on populism when we said that don't confuse populism for something that is popular, as people will do. Similarly, a lot of the terms we will be talking about today, the common noun means one thing, but the proper noun, what the label has come to mean, means something else entirely. So I know many liberals who are not liberal. I know many progressive people who espouse policies that would actually set us back and not take us forward. I know many conservatives who hold radical views, right? I know many nationalists who in my view are anti-national because the sort of thing they stand for doesn't really help the nation. So that's one thing that we have to be careful of. That, I saw a friend once post on Facebook that, why is liberal used as a bad word today? And that epithet has been hurled at me as well. Why is it used as a bad word today when actually this is what it means, and he gave the dictionary definition. And that's a classic mistake. All labels have come to acquire a baggage of meanings, often contradictory ones as we'll discuss, which have nothing to do with the common noun sort of term. So we've got to beware of that. The second thing that we must note is that many of these terms have evolved over time. Like liberal, for example, in Europe today means almost the opposite of what it means in the US today, right? And it has evolved over time, and we shall talk about that evolution. But it's important to talk about that. Woke was once a good word, and today it's with some justification used as a pejorative also. How did it evolve that way? And so on and so forth. And at this point, I shall share with you Varma's fifth law. Do you know the first four laws?
No, not even one.
Neither do I. I mean, I have shared one here about, every interference in free markets being a redistribution from the poor to the rich. But Varma's fifth law, and I will figure out three more in between later. All labels that bestow any kind of prestige or virtue upon the bearer eventually come to mean the opposite, as grifters and opportunists outnumber the believers. Right? So that's Varma's fifth law. And this brings me to my third point. And the third point is, and the reason we are hesitant to use labels, is that labels are attached too strongly and too often to ideological tribes, right? So you begin thinking that liberalism is a good thing. Both of us would broadly say that, okay, we are liberal, and in different ways we are also conservative, and I'll explain how you can be both at the same time. But there'll be a tribe of people who call themselves liberal. There'll be a tribe of people who'll call themselves libertarian or conservative or progressive and so on and so forth. And eventually, many of these people within these tribes are not just thinking of first principles. Instead, they are adopting all the ideological dogmas of that particular tribe and they are going with it. And if the tribe moves in a particular direction away from those principles, so will they. We've seen this most spectacularly 2014 onwards in America, where Trump took over the Republican Party. And I would have imagined that there will be an outcry, there will be resistance, because the Republican Party typically consists of many conservatives and some libertarians, and we'll explain both those terms later. And yet, so many of them turned to an almost unanimous acceptance of Trump because they were part of that tribe. These were their people, this was their man, and they hated the other side also, which plays a part. But what that has resulted in is an American president today who is neither conservative nor libertarian, nor any good epithet that we can bestow upon him. They've lost his way completely. And it was shocking and sad for me to see this. I even saw this in India to a different extent, and we can talk about that later, where people who pledged allegiance to a set of principles and values are actually only tribal, and they're thinking my side, other side, and they're not thinking about those values at all. And it makes me very sad. And that's what's happened to labels. And that is why I refuse labels. There was a time I would have described myself as classical liberal or libertarian, and they broadly fit, but not completely. But today I refuse all labels, because labels have been cheapened by the tribalism that has been attached to every label. So before I start talking about what these terms mean in a context of politics and the way they are used, I want to make this clarification clear. Forget the common noun, understand that these labels have evolved over time and take that into account, and ignore the tribalistic connotations. I know people who will criticize the Libertarian Party in America and say, look, the Libertarian Party did this, which is not libertarian, therefore all libertarianism is nonsense. And my point is, no, that particular tribe of people who call themselves libertarians are hypocrites if they're doing something not libertarian. It doesn't mean libertarianism is bad. And I'm just using one label here. You take any label of your choice, whatever you might identify with.
In this, I want to say three things. The first is a line that we used in recent weeks. It is the fate of every great idea to start out as a cause and then become a movement and then become a racket. Okay, so ideas don't stand still. Political formations develop around these things, and many things go to hell. The second principle is that an idea is not responsible for the people who believe in it. Okay, so when you say that Trump believes X, therefore X is an idiotic idea, not true, not fair, not correct. An idea is not responsible for the person that believes in it. Ideas should be argued and judged and debated around a variety of intellectual aspects, but this is not a gotcha, and the people who do that are being unfair. And the third thing is about tribalism. I feel that many people just feel the need to be in a gang, to be with others, to feel solidarity. And I'm speaking as a person that has no interest at all in solidarity or being in a gang. I just look at people with a sense of mystery, like, what are you doing? It doesn't make any sense. And I often think about the minor matter of being correct. Like, you have to figure out stuff. You have to undertake good actions in the world. You have to succeed. You have to forecast the nature of the world, that this intervention will lead to that kind of damage. And being correct matters. It's not just all ideology, but there's something very sad about the world, that the tribal instinct is so powerful.
Before we get to the labels, there's another broad point I want to address. We will try our best here to speak in a neutral manner about what these labels mean and what they stand for, so that even if you identify with them, you'll say that, yeah, They've defined it correctly. I'll do that. But what I also want to do at the start, in the interest of transparency, is lay out the set of beliefs that you and I share about the world. And I think this set of beliefs is not really subjective. There's the evidence of centuries of data and things happening in the real world which lead us to argue these things with a certain amount of certainty. And here they are. Number one, the world is not zero sum. Right? A lot of political thinking, a lot of the basics of different ideologies are based on the assumption that the world is zero sum. There is a fixed amount of wealth, there is a fixed pie, and that is simply not true. We have earlier in the past, like in our episode on luxury beliefs, spoken about inequality and poverty, why they are very different things. Where if you have a fixed pie and you have a zero sum world, then yes, if poverty goes up, so will inequality. But in the real world, which is positive sum, they go in opposite directions. And the policies you need to handle both are opposites of each other. And therefore, you need to understand the terms and understand the world carefully. If you want to remove poverty, it is not a simple matter as it would be in a fixed pie of taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. That simply doesn't work. That makes everybody worse off. It leads to a negative sum game. What you need is to play to growth for everyone. That's point one. We've elaborated on that in different episodes. Point two is that top-down thinking simply doesn't work. Again, in our episode on fallacies, we discuss this in some detail, that our instincts were hardwired into us in the hunter-gatherer age. We lived in small tribes, everything was manageable. And even though there were no engineers per se, the engineering mindset that I will design this from the top down could work. But at the level of a large society, it simply does not work. It leads to disaster. And, in our chapters on socialism, communism, Marxism, Statism, we'll speak more on this. I will elaborate. But again, this is a fundamental belief that we have. Our third belief, gentle readers, is that we should judge actions based on outcomes and not intentions. A common matter to every ideology is that their intentions are great, that this is what we will deliver, whether it is social justice or equality for all, and etc., etc. And all of these intentions sound fantastic, and I will not argue with any of these good intentions. What we need to see is what are the outcomes of the policies that emerge out of those ways of thinking. And we should strictly be focused on outcomes. And this brings me to my fourth one, that both of us believe in the power of freedom, not just in a moral sense, that freedom is good in and of itself, but also in a consequential sense, that freedom leads to the best outcomes. And therefore, we have to think in terms of individual freedom. We have to think in terms of what is good for each individual, each person, and not in terms of groups. The moment you divide society into groups and you build narratives of oppression and victimhood and you start playing that particular game, it simply never ever works out well. Individuals contain multitudes, and again we'll discuss this more in future chapters. So these are sort of broad precepts, and all of these would not have been stuff I would have thought about when I was 18 or 19 or whatever. I was of a different persuasion at that time. But over time, you could say I've been mugged by reality and I've come to understand the world a little better. And all of these just seem so fundamental and so important for all of us to internalize.
It's a beautiful set of first principles that I think all of us should sign on to. When you were saying intentions and outcomes, I was thinking of Adolf Hitler. If your objective was the glory and furtherance of the Germanic peoples of German DNA, then there was no bigger disaster for that than the man who espoused this the most. He espoused this the most fiercely, but he got something terribly wrong. Okay. Similarly, if you think that we're going to do something great for the working class, and then you end up with catastrophes like Russia and China, then clearly you failed to understand something deep about the world, and you've just got the worst possible outcomes. So I totally get this point, and I always push on this idea that, come on, you got to be right, that after 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, it's got to work, it's got to come out right. Just having fancy claims doesn't suffice. So Amit, let's get started with liberal.
So let's talk about the etymology of the word liberal, right? It comes from the Latin liber or liberalis, and what that means is generous and befitting a free person, right? And this is where we get the common noun sense of the word. Like some people will often say about a particular woman that she is liberal with her affections, or they will say about a man who gives too freely that he is liberal with his wealth. Look at his friends, he should not give money to them, too liberal, etc., etc. So that generosity is a good thing. And again, all of these terms start meaning something that is good and that draws from the common noun version of it. Now, the father of liberalism, one of the great thinkers of history, is John Locke. And John Locke came up with a conception of natural rights which goes thus. Locke's argument was that the fundamental right which we are all born with is the right to self-ownership. We own ourselves, right? Because if we don't own ourselves, who does? You know, it's absurd to say the state owns us or the king owns us or whatever. So the fundamental thing, if you want to recognize the value of an individual, is the right to self-ownership. And from this, Locke derives a set of other rights, all of which, according to him, have to come from this and this alone. And for example, the right to life, right? If you own yourself, no one can kill you, and therefore the right to life. The right to free speech. And we have a great episode on this as well, because if you own your thoughts and you own your expression of them, then no one has the right to make you shut up. The right to property. If you mix your labor with something which doesn't belong to anyone else, then you can call it yours and no one can steal from you, right? And from this emerge a class of rights which are called negative rights. At that time they were just called rights, but later on they were called negative rights. But it's a distinction between negative and positive rights drawn by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. And the reason they're called negative rights is for these rights to be respected, other people may not do something to you, right? So no one should kill me, no one should shut me up, no one should steal from me. Those negatives. People should not do something to me that infringes my right. So therefore they are called negative rights. And my rights really apply to me and gain meaning if I respect the negative rights of others. So that's the caveat around which this edifice begins to be constructed, right? And this was such an inspiring formulation that, in fact, the birth of feminism happens with this. You know, Mary Wollstonecraft, who is again a great thinker, one of my great heroes, at the end of the 18th century, reads Locke, and she takes it to the logical next conclusion that if all of us have these inalienable rights, then it's not just the men, it's also the women, which was a radical thought in those times because, you know, the common pronoun used everywhere was he, him. That's how people spoke. You know, men were the whole thing. And it seems so bizarre to think of it now, but I have an episode on Mary Wollstonecraft in an audio podcast I used to do. We'll link that from the show notes. And Wollstonecraft was inspired by that, and the birth of modern feminism came out of that. Feminism, of course, we are not talking about it today because it's really a vast subject and straddles much more than political theory. But that was an aside. Now, let's talk about those rights. What is the point of you and I having rights if there's no one to enforce them? You know, can we live in a world which is a free-for-all, where everything is nasty, brutish, and short, to use the word of Hobbes? And therefore, we come to the conception of the state. In his book, Common Sense, Thomas Paine referred to government as a necessary evil. That's where the phrase first comes from. And from there comes that liberal conception that we have rights, and for our life to have any meaning, our individual agency, our rights must be protected, and we need someone to protect this, and therefore a state. But why is it a state a necessary evil? Where necessary, yes. Where does evil come from? That's because for the state to exist, we are giving up some of our rights, and because the state has a monopoly on violence and it survives on taxes which are coerced from us. And we are doing this in a sense willingly because it's a compromise we make. I call it the great liberal paradox, that for our rights to have meaning, we must give up some of them, right? And this is fundamental to understanding political theory, because to me, the battle between all ideologies is simply a battle on how much violence it is, how much violence is justified for the state to do, right? Every ideology involves a state doing something or the other, except a form of libertarianism we'll come to. And the only question is, when is that violence justified? And we have to accept and acknowledge that there is that violence. So this is the notion that we have rights and there is a minimal state whose job is to serve us, not to rule us. and whose job is to protect us, a liberal conception. Now, there is a great quote by Adam Smith I will repeat here because it really sums up, even today, after 2.5 centuries, what is a fundamental truth about societies and economies. And I'm going to read this out. Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of things. All governments which thwart this natural course, which force things into another channel, or which endeavor to arrest the progress of society at a particular point, are unnatural, and to support themselves are obliged to be oppressive and tyrannical. And in fact, you will be pleased to know that the word liberal was probably first used in a political context, apart from the common noun context, by Smith himself, where in The Wealth of Nations, he writes about the liberal system of free exportation and free importation, right? So globalization, zindabad. So for me, it's really John Locke and Adam Smith, and in the social sense, Mary Wollstonecraft, who are early pioneers of liberalism, the parents, so to say. Right? But this is not sort of where the story ends, right? Liberalism has its heyday in the 19th century because the Industrial Revolution also happens and the power of free markets is apparent to all. And while the term liberal was originally used as a pejorative term, oh look, there goes that liberal. And it's interesting how it's come full circle to being a pejorative again in some circles. But it was initially used as a pejorative term, as was conservative, and I'll come back to that. But eventually it gained such a halo that people wanted to use that term to describe themselves, even if they weren't really liberal. And this is what happened in the 20th century, where in the 20th century there came about the concept of not they came about the concept of positive rights, but there came about the practice of referring to entitlements as positive rights. Now let's come to positive rights. I spoke about negative rights earlier, what someone may not do to you, the right to life, the right to free speech, they all come from that. There's also a class of entitlements which people started calling rights, and so Berlin made the distinction. And these are called positive because if you have a right to X, somebody has to give it to you, right? So a right to food is a positive right. You know, if I say I have a right to food, that means the state has to feed me, and that means to give me my positive right. The state has to infringe the negative right of someone else because they have to tax someone else or even me myself to to give me that food. So rights to a right to food, a right to free broadband, and so on and so forth, which somebody has to give you, are all positive rights. And my argument here is not an argument that the state shouldn't feed people. In a famine, for example, or in an emergency, you could argue that's the job of the state. These are the people, there's an emergency, you got to feed them. So the point is not about the desirability of these entitlements. The point is about the terminology. Because if we get confused about the terminology, then everything kind of gets woolly and all debates get wrapped up in nothing. And the new liberals, the American liberals, and note that this happened only in America where the term changed, embrace this. They embraced the role of the state in solving for inequality, as they put it, and we've discussed why this is such a zero-sum worldview. And more state intervention came into being. When we have a chapter on progressives, I'll also kind of mention where that comes into it along parallel lines. But then liberalism in America came to mean a lot of state action to correct for the social inequalities that they perceived, and a big role for the state, a welfare state, positive rights, etc., etc. And therefore, it was no longer a limited government, the night watchman state, which was a necessary evil, but instead it was an all-encompassing my baap, which had to feed you and clothe you. And this did not happen in Europe. So even today in Europe, the word liberal means something much more in the original sense, while in the US, it means something else entirely. And, you and I are old school liberals. Another term for this, to demystify terms, it would be classical liberal, right? That we could call ourselves classical liberal, again commonly used as a pejorative in some circles. And, most libertarians really are just classical liberals. And we'll come to that in our chapter on libertarianism. But yeah, that's a liberal worldview. We've outlined it in previous episodes, like episode 25 was just about understanding this. And in many of our episodes, without putting that label to it, we kind of espouse a liberal worldview. But I would, this is what the term kind of means. And I'm hesitant to ever use that term because in popular parlance in America, it means one thing, in Europe, it means one thing, and different people, will use a term in the same conversation meaning different things. And it makes conversation difficult and impossible. And therefore, I just sort of avoid the term unless I am with people like you, and you'll know in what sense I mean it and you mean it, and we can have that conversation.
We were at liberal, now take us to conservative.
So let's again go to the etymology of the term. The original Latin which it comes from basically means to conserve, to preserve, what it appears to actually say. Conservatism is a political movement, again started in the middle of the 18th century, and it was about people who wanted to conserve a particular thing. But the question here is, conserve what? So number one, conserve an established order, which could be the monarchy, which could be a dictatorship, which could be a particular system of organizing government or whatever. So it just came to mean that no other values. I want to preserve the monarchy, so conservative. I'm talking about early meanings of the term. And then over time, it has evolved to also be loosely used in terms of conserving different kinds of values. Right? So you might have, say, a Christian conservative who wants to preserve Christian values, like family values, for example. Or you might have conservatives who want to preserve values of free enterprise against the encroachment of the welfare state. They are also conservatives in a sense. So in a broad sense, conservative is about conserving something that exists and that is under threat. But in a specific sense, what does it mean? What is the political philosophy behind it, and why should we all consider it seriously and take it seriously? And that for me comes from Edmund Burke. In 1790, Edmund Burke wrote this great pamphlet called Reflections on the Revolution in France. A French Revolution was underway, and Burke looked at it, and it was again being fought for the best intentions, liberty, equality, fraternity, etc., etc. And Burke's warning was that, fine, I get the intentions are awesome, more power to you, but the means by which you are carrying out this revolution are completely messed up, right? And one of the great one of the notable people behind the French Revolution was a guy called Maximilien Robespierre. And in our life lessons course, we have this awesome webinar called The History of Ideas, which I had so much fun putting it together, because I just created postcards for every sort of great advance that happened in the history of ideas. And gentle readers, you will now see two of those postcards. And one is a letter from Robespierre to Edmund Burke, and I made up these letters, but with quotes from the original people, but the letters are made up by me. And this is Robespierre to Burke, and you can pause the video and see each of these if you want, where he's kind of saying that, hey, what the fuck, you old fogey, shut up, what are you trying to conserve? You're trying to make a better world, blah, blah, blah. And then here's Burke's reply to Robespierre, where he says that, bro, I warned you. I hope you're around to read this, which of course Robespierre by then wasn't. He himself had been purged after doing a fair amount of purging, and that means matter. Now, what is the broader point here? The broader point here is that you have to think about ends and means. Right? Your ends could be whatever, building a better society in whatever way you want. You gentle readers might want society in a particular way. You and I might want different certain things. In fact, we will want different things because we disagree on a fair bit of things too. But the key core question is about the means. How do we achieve this? And Burke's warning is this. He's saying that you might be young and hot-blooded and think that the world sucks in many ways and you want to tear everything down. But please understand that the edifices that exist, the institutions that exist, the norms that exist for a particular reason. They have, gone through natural selection. They've passed the test of time. They exist for a reason, which is not to say they should not be changed. By all means, change the world. That is the only way we progress and live good lives. But think about how you do it. You can't just burn everything to the ground. That simply doesn't work. You have to think about how to proceed. And this to me is a deeply important point that we always need to consider. Now, when I think about the Indian freedom struggle, for example, I think about who are my heroes during that freedom struggle. And my great heroes actually predate Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, and Ambedkar, and all of those people, though they're all great people and heroes of mine as well. My great heroes are the moderates of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Dadabhau Naoroji, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Gopal Ganesh Agarkar, Ranade, all of those great people. And what they were doing is, and the way that I describe them and the way I think of them, is that they were liberal in their ends but conservative in their means. They wanted a better world, they wanted more freedom, they wanted more empowerment for the Indian people, but they didn't just want to burn everything down in random acts of violence, but they wanted to, go towards it one step at a time, and they thought carefully about the means. In fact, a lot of a lot of literature will talk about the moderates and the extremists in the Congress party. The moderates being people like Gokhale, Agarkar, Ranade, the extremists being people like Tilak and so on. The great Scottish statesman James Gerard Hardy once pointed out that the moderates were extreme in their moderation and the extremists were moderate in their extremism. So they weren't actually that far apart. Till that black swan event called Gandhi appears on the scene, where he completely breaks from everything that has come before. All of these people are, in a sense, liberal, broadly liberal in their ends and conservative in their means. And I think that's a good thing. And I don't think, when people talk about Indian conservatism, when they apply the word to India, there is no conservatism here. I had an episode with Jerry Rao, who wrote a book on Indian conservatism, and we had a very lively back and forth. To people who say I don't argue with my guests, you should see that episode. And my whole point was that, he was projecting something on India which doesn't exist. That kind of Burkean conservatism, that careful, considered thinking about everything existing for a reason, and therefore go step by step, break it down gradually, progress with caution, that isn't really there. The kind of conservatism that is there is often of preserving the past purely for the sake of preserving the past, or, in a reactionary way against modernity. Or a lot of Indian conservatism is actually pretty radical, where you go against whatever tolerant or liberal instincts may automatically exist in Indian society, which is after all so assimilative, and instead tries to create an other and tries to create schisms and tries to bring about a particular kind of tribalism. And we'll talk about this later when we talk about nationalism. So a lot of the people who are called conservative here today are actually anything but. They are going against some of our finer traditions. So this is, my big picture. And the interesting thing to note is, like the term liberal, conservative was first used as a cuss word by other people against Burke, and he did not coin the term in this political context. And another term that is like this is a football term. Do you know it, Ajay Shah? The word is tiki-taka. Right? So tiki-taka is used for Pep Guardiola's style of football, which of course comes from the great Johan Cruyff's total football, which is, these beautiful triangular passing movements based on possession and etc. etc. But the truth is, Guardiola hates a term. He didn't coin it. It was first coined by a broadcaster, Andres Montes, during the 2006 World Cup, before Guardiola was a coach, describing the pointless passing of Spain in that particular World Cup. And the coach of Athletic Bilbao, Javier Clemente, during around that time, used it in the same way, where he said, oh, Spain, they're just doing tiki-taka, in Spanish, right? So a negative term, and that somehow gotten attached to Barcelona's later style of playing, and Guardiola is a philosophical genius, one of my heroes. But what happens to philosophical geniuses? They are denigrated, they are abused, they are kicked about. It happens in economics, it happens in football. It is very, very sad. Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, Pep Guardiola, these are all geniuses, and we should respect and venerate them.
I want to say two things in continuation of where you are. So, gentle reader, notice the two very different impulses hiding inside the word conservative. Okay, one impulse is the preservation of the established order, and it could be religion, it could be family, it could be social structure, it could be an oligarchy. Okay, so there are always people who are in love with the old and say, look, don't change my life. And there is that thing running in the word conservative. Okay, and then there is a very different, extremely sophisticated idea in the word conservative, which I pit around 2 points. One is that the world is incredibly complex. So don't ever engage in a grand scheme where some band of people will use coercive means and change the world in a dramatic way. Okay? And the second part is means matter. Okay? These are closely interrelated. So that second meaning of conservatism, I think a lot of us should be far more willing to sign on to. It's a respect for the richness and complexity of the world. It's a mistrust of any grand scheme. You give me any great leader, you give me any government which is trying to transform the world, and we should instantly become skeptical because nobody understands the complexity of the world. And then you get to this means matter, which is that if somebody will wave a big stick and try to do a French Revolution, surely it's going to go badly. Okay, so there are feeble minds like Indian Civil Service Rank 1, Subhash Chandra Bose, who wanted to pick up guns and change the order. And we know from all over the world that when anti-colonial movements were done with guns, they worked very badly, that the legacy of violence just ripped up that society. So that part I feel we are far more willing to sign on to. And then that takes us to how liberal and conservative can be seen as opposing ends of a spectrum. Like, wait, if I read the dictionary definition of liberal, basically we should have more freedom to live our life on our own terms, versus conservative, we should not change the world, we should not allow the world to be changed, or that respect that the world is complex, means matter. How do these become opposites to each other? And I think this takes us to the great thinking and writing all the way from Adam Smith till Karl Marx, where people deeply understood how the edifice of modern capitalism and modern globalization was a great wild west wind that was tearing up the world, that was going to destroy the feudal order, and that was bringing a new and better world. Okay, this was what the thinkers from Adam Smith till Marx figured out. Okay, there are entire chunks of the Communist Manifesto that are absolutely brilliant, where he understands deeply how capitalism and globalization will tear up the feudal order, and that's such a great thing. Okay, so when this started happening in the world, there was a whole people who said, no, I want my old privileges. Okay, I'm happy with some feudal lords and owning the lands and having a disproportionate share of wealth, of political influence. Okay, so for a related note, I want to turn to India. Okay, remember how in like 1947 or 1907, think of the word land, think of the primal emotions associated in a old North Indian machismo, actually all over India, around the word land, because land ownership was synonymous to wealth, land ownership was synonymous to income. So if you had land, you had wealth, you had income, and the game was grabbing more and more land, owning more and more land. A person with 50,000 acres was a bigger person than a person with 10,000 acres, okay, and so on. But look at the modern world. The wealth of today's India is not created out of land. The wealth is created out of business. You build Infosys, you build Reliance Industries, okay? You build businesses, and that's how you create wealth. That whole land thing just got obsolete, meaning, yeah, it's cute, meaning it's nice to have some land, but it's neither necessary nor sufficient to be a rich, successful, important person in the modern Indian landscape. And that is what the conservatives did not want. The conservatives wanted that old landed life. They wanted the landed aristocracy and the world of agriculture and their privileges and their power and their influence. So that whole package of aristocracy and the feudal lords and religion and family, this whole old package was loved by the people who were beneficiaries of that system. And it was the liberal approach of, look, just have freedom, just do peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, and you're going to get a wild west wind which will create mind-blowing levels of growth and prosperity and create a whole new world in which those old privileges will be destroyed. So I think this is the interesting interconnection between the word liberal and these two meanings of the word conservative.
I love the nuance you just gave of the two meanings of conservative, because when I think of the first meaning, I am completely against it. I want to change the world. The world needs to be changed in so many different radical ways, and I want to play a part in bringing those changes about. But in the second sense of the term, that please appreciate the complexity of the world and don't have the hubris of thinking you can remake the society from the top down. In that sense, I'm completely on board with it. So that's a great distinction.
Okay, Amit, take us to the other end of the journey. Words Marxism, socialism, and communism.
These three are related, so you're right that they kind of belong together in one section, but at the same time, they mean subtly different things. You can think of Marxism as a theory, socialism as a path, communism as a destination. So if you think about it in that way and they kind of emerged in that order, it begins to make sense. Now, Marxism is something that emerges from the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In 1848, there was a Communist Manifesto. In 1867, there was Das Kapital. And the philosophy emerges from there. It was a way of looking at the world, right? So let me kind of sum up the salient features of Marxism. Their first big point, which runs through everything, is about the oppressed and the oppressors. That it's essentially that the world has two classes: the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and the proletariat, which is the working class. That's your first point. They look at everything through the prism of class, that these are the two classes and they're oppressor and oppressed, and it's not a good state of things. Second main point, the proletariat is oppressed by the bourgeoisie. The workers are oppressed. If you work in a factory, you are actually oppressed. Your surplus value is all being taken by the evil capitalist, the factory owner, and this is a problem. And you gradually, as a worker, you get alienated from your work, and you just, it affects you and it affects the way that you are. And in the Marxist theory, everything in society flows from these material circumstances. That these are your two classes, one class is oppressing the other, everything else, society, culture, etc., flows from this. And where this then goes on is that Marxism talks about how this must be changed. It cannot continue because eventually the workers will be completely impoverished by capitalism. And then they will have to, overthrow their feudal lords, as it were. And ideally, you want to live in a society where everyone is equal, but to get there first, you need the workers to overthrow the evil capitalists, and therefore that will lead to what they call dictatorship of the proletariat, a phrase that you must have heard. This is where it comes from. So the theory as a whole is really seductive, and the interesting thing about all ideologies is that they will come up with a theory of the world where everything can fit. If you think about it, you can explain everything through this theory. Whatever happens, you can fit it into this. That, oppressor oppressed chal raha hai, and etc., and whatever happens, you can fit it into this. And any ideological theory that works will appear to explain everything, and therefore is deeply seductive to the young. Indeed, I must confess, Ajay Shah, that when I was 18, I remember going to college once, and for a few days in my bag, I carried around with me Das Kapital by Marx and Engels. Yeah, because I've actually read these books when I was young. But thank God they didn't completely destroy my brain. But yeah, I did that then. And I also thought, I'm so cool, I'm an intellectual, and, all of those things. And so that's, what Marxism is. I've tried to, do justice to its definition. Now let's talk a little bit about the criticisms of Marxism that have come from various quarters. Criticism number one, that Marxist framework brings everything down to a question of class struggle. So there's no space for culture, society, art, what else is happening. Everything is down to this. Max Weber has written about this. Karl Popper has written about this. This is one of their central criticisms of communism, that everything comes down to this. Popper has also pointed out a second major criticism, that, hey, the theory predicts that capitalism will collapse because worker will be too impoverished. But hey, that hasn't happened. It's a point Fukuyama also elegantly made, that, this is part of the central edifice on which all of Marxism rests, that everything should collapse because workers are being exploited. And the fundamental premise behind this thinking is zero-sum thinking, that if it was zero-sum thinking, if surplus value was actually being carried away by the evil capitalist, then eventually in the zero-sum game, workers would be wiped out, they would be impoverished, and then of course they would rise up in revolution. That's bound to happen. But however, that hasn't happened. History shows us that economies are a positive sum game, that many proletariat go on to become bourgeoisie. So that's not the way the world functions. Another criticism actually comes from the left. Right, this comes from the likes of Michel Foucault, this comes from modern intersectional thinkers who criticize Marxism by saying that according to Marxism, everything is class. What about race? What about gender? What about nationality? What about ethnicity, etc., etc.? All these factors in India, you would say, what about caste? All these factors also play into shaping society, and all these factors even play into the oppressor framework. So Marxism is therefore getting it wrong by just focusing on one thing, because that was what Marx and Engels saw, and that appeared to explain everything. The fourth criticism comes from Isaiah Berlin, where he says that actually you're looking at a society which is classless, stateless, etc., etc., everyone is equal, blah, blah, blah. It's against human nature. It cannot work because human nature is not like that, because we are driven by self-interest. And, as Adam Smith correctly pointed out, that is how we all progress at the same time. And therefore, it simply cannot work. Forget the fact of what is desirable, it simply cannot work. The great biologist E.O. Wilson has a great quote on communism, where he says, great idea, wrong species. His point was that it would work for ants. He told Karl Marx, and of course Marx died well before E.O. Wilson was born. You can imagine a conversation between them. E.O. Wilson telling Karl Marx that, dude, great freaking theory, man, but sell it to the ants. Ain't gonna work here. And ants are actually already like that. You don't need to sell anything to them. So this is, the fourth criticism. The fifth criticism, it comes from the likes of Hannah Arendt and Raymond Aron, and which is that the means are completely wrong. That if you want to get to where Marxism says we should get to, first the dictatorship of the proletariat and then that classless society, so to say, you can only do so through extreme violence. And that is bad in and of itself. And point number one is to note is that violence is bad in and of itself, hardly needs to be elaborated upon. And point number two is that it won't even get you there. It will just break everything down completely, impoverish everyone, and you're not even going to achieve that end with these means. But if this is your vision of a society, the only way of doing it is through mass violence, and that is what indeed we have seen in the Soviet Union, in Maoist China, more recently in Venezuela. Right? It simply can't be done. So these are sort of the major criticisms of Marxism that have come down through the ages.
I want to add two things here. The minor matter of coming out correct. So there's an old joke in the Soviet Union where, the saying that in order to make omelets, you've got to break some eggs, which is sort of glossing over and justifying some of the violence, some of the destruction. And then the person says, we broke a lot of eggs, where's the omelette? That in the end, the Soviet Union completely failed as a society. Communist China completely failed as a society. You and I have an episode on how the China model is broken in the sense of a high level of state control. It isn't even working today, meaning they have abandoned many a communist precept, but that high level of state control, it isn't working. At a more analytical level, Karl Marx saw the business cycle fluctuations that are ordinarily present in capitalism and somehow came up with this idea that the fluctuations are going to get worse. Okay, so business cycle fluctuations are a part of the normal machine of capitalism. Financial crises are a part of the normal machine of capitalism. These things cannot be eliminated and should not be eliminated. That's how this works. We go through boom and bust. We go through crazy optimism, and then there is overinvestment, and then there's a crash. This is the normal rhythm of things. Karl Marx came up with an analytical claim that the magnitude of these fluctuations will go up in the future. Okay, so in the late 19th century, he started telling a story that, look, the fluctuations are getting worse. After he died came the Great Depression. And that was seen by many people as proof that he was actually on the right track. And Standing in 2025, we know that no, not particularly, that the Great Depression was indeed the biggest ever shock that happened to the global capitalist system. But after that, we haven't got particularly big shocks. The 2008 crisis, all in all, was relatively small. The great economist Robert Lucas has remarked that really business cycle fluctuations are a small thing compared to the grand drama of growth. That the outstanding feature of the capitalist economy is growth, that you get richer over the years, which is a great bounty. I mean, yeah, there'll be some fluctuations, but when you correctly draw the graph, the fluctuations appear irrelevant. The dominant phenomenon is the growth. And so that incredible success and prosperity of all the advanced economies today has come about under a liberal democratic capitalist system with shades of grey. Never did a socialist or communist approach deliver results. Okay, so we've all seen the standard nighttime lights picture of North Korea versus South Korea. That you got these clean controlled experiments that the treatment was applied on East Germany and West Germany. And West Germany worked and East Germany didn't. North Korea and South Korea and so on. So I think this stuff of being right and being wrong is core. You've got to care about winning. You've got to care about coming out right. And a lot of the left crew is just lost in some ideology. Again, maybe if you were standing in 1917 at the time of the Russian Revolution, you had some claims about the world. Fine. Maybe when the Great Depression happened, you could claim that, wow, you see, our analytical toolkit had the correct predictions. We understood that the global capitalist system is dynamically unstable and the fluctuations are getting worse. Fine. But 2025, to hold such beliefs, you're truly confused. And so I say about the great Amit Varma. He who has not been a Marxist as a child has no heart, and he who is a Marxist as an adult has no brain.
So I want to, which is of course a paraphrasing of a very famous quote, I think, about communism. But I want to say three things to that. Number one, you use the term left. We haven't explained it yet. That's a later chapter. Don't use words which we haven't explained already, which basically would mean don't say anything. But no, please. All great points by you. Regarding my second point is that regarding the Great Depression, we discussed in an earlier episode how today, looking back, we actually realized that really it was caused by state action. Thomas Sowell has written about this eloquently, and we've also spoken about it. I forget in which episode, but we'll link it here. And my third point is that a critical difference that I want to point out between liberalism, which we spoke about earlier, especially in the classical sense, and Marxism, is that liberalism is sinking at the level of the individual. That's a unit. That's who they care about. Marxism is sinking at the level of a group. In this particular case, bourgeoisie and proletariat. But you can have any ideology which looks at the world in terms of groups, and I would say you've got it fatally wrong. That you're not respecting complexity, that every individual contains multitudes and you should not essentialize, and all these groups are mutable in different ways, and it's a great folly, it's a great conceptual folly to think in those terms. I would even say don't use the word society when you talk about the good of society. It's really dangerous. What we should put at the center is individual rights and the rights of every individual. As Ayn Rand said, the smallest minority is the individual.
Yeah. And also respect the richness and complexity and the variability of people. People are all different. Each person is different. Like reducing a person to a label like you're a woman is really not fair. There's so much richness and complexity there. And then respect the heterogeneity, respect the differences, respect the inequality. Okay, everybody is not born with an ELO of 2830. Okay, much as I might dream of playing chess, my ELO sucks, and you just got to accept this. We're all different. I'm not Magnus. So there is a huge variation. Some are pretty, some are tall, some are 2830. So we should not obsess on picking up any label and calculating some averages and say, see, men are taller than women. Okay, Amit, socialism?
So you've actually hit a hot button for me. This really triggers me, this particular term, because in India it is almost used in a benign way, where people just assume that, oh, socialism means what is good for society.
Like public goods.
You like public.
Is
So
my trigger.
is your trigger. So why are you triggering yourself, Ajay Shah? But anyway, I will trigger myself. So socialism, people imagine, oh, what is good for society, what is wrong in that, it's a good thing, that is why the state should work, etc., etc. And I want to point out that no, it is not that. It has a specific meaning in political science. The people who shaped our republic were aware of this. As I will point out later, B.R. Ambedkar had some non-complimentary things to say about socialism as well. But let's first go to a definition of socialism, which really sums up what it is all about. I'll read that out. Socialism is a broad political and economic ideology that advocates for collective or state ownership of the means of production with the goal of reducing or eliminating inequality and ensuring that wealth and power are fairly distributed. Stop quote. So this is important. It talks about a collective ownership of property. In the case of communism, the state kind of owns everything. But in the case of socialism, there are degrees of this. Now, we have planned a future episode where we will talk about the importance of private property, how that concept evolved and why it's important and essential to human progress. And socialism doesn't understand that truth and disrespects that truth. And the idea is that the means of production should be owned by the state and then used for the good of the people. Noble intentions, outcomes end up being terrible. Now, what are sort of the fundamental aspects of socialism? There are 4 aspects of socialism which to me make for a complete definition. Number 1, public ownership of resources, again to different degrees. So democratic socialism, Marxist socialism might differ on degree, but to a large extent the state owns a lot of the resources and owns a lot of property, and there's not that much respect for private property. Number 1, public ownership of resources. Number 2, a redistribution of these resources to bring about equal outcomes. Number 3, a planned economy. Because everything is top down, you have to plan an economy from the top down and make sure everything works.
Once you control everything, you then plan it.
Correct. You control everything and then you plan it so everything is going well. Evil capitalists or private parties who don't care about others can't mess things up. And the 4th is actually a series of intentions that we would not really disagree with. Prosperity, equality, blah, blah, blah. We would agree with those, except that none of those intentions are actually achieved by socialism. In fact, they are hurt. It is the opposite. That's why we made that point at the start, that you have to judge policies and actions by their outcomes and not their intentions. So this is sort of one way of summing up what socialism means in a political theory context, right? And this debate on how socialist should we be actually came up before our Constituent Assembly. Right now, as we happen to know that Jawaharlal Nehru was under the sway of a bunch of thinkers he encountered in England called the Fabian Society, and he was what we would call a Fabian socialist, which is a sort of democratic socialism where the state controls industry and the economy is centrally planned and you have 5-year plans and all of that. We've discussed that in many previous episodes. Episode 10 on freedom discusses that. Our recent episode on manufacturing, part 1, discusses that. We've discussed that a lot. Let's not go down that road. But it came up in the Constituent Assembly that a preamble was written, and K.T. Shah in 1948 said that there is a problem with this preamble and he wanted 3 words to be added to it. And Ambedkar objected to 2 of them, secular and socialist. And he said they will not be in my preamble, and they were not. Those 2 words were added in the mid-1970s by Indira Gandhi. Right? What were his objections? Now, both of us believe in secularism and are secular, and so did he. His objection was that we don't need to put that word out there. It is practically virtue signaling. Secularism is written into every article of the Constitution, and we don't need to randomly spell it out, so that should not be there. But what was his argument for socialists not being there? And these are really wise words by a great thinker. So I want to read out what he said in a speech at that time to the Constituent Assembly. This is 1948. Sir, I regret that I cannot accept the amendment of Professor K.T. Shah. My objections, stated briefly, are 2. In the first place, the Constitution, as I stated in my opening speech in support of the motion I made before the House, is merely a mechanism for the purpose of regulating the work of the various organs of the state. It is not a mechanism whereby particular members of particular parties are installed in office. What should be the policy of the state, how the society should be organized in a social and economic side, are matters which must be decided by the people themselves according to time and circumstances. It cannot be laid down in the constitution itself, because that is destroying democracy altogether. If you state in the constitution that the social organization of the state shall take a particular form, you are, in my judgment, taking away the liberty of the people to decide what should be the social organization in which they may wish to live. It is perfectly possible today for the majority people to hold that the socialist organization of society is better than the capitalist organization of society. But it would be perfectly possible for thinking people to devise some other form of social organization which might be better than the socialist organization of today or tomorrow. I do not therefore see why the constitution should tie down the people to live in a particular form and not leave it to the people themselves to decide it for themselves. This is one reason why the amendment should be opposed. Like really eloquent words, where he's saying that we don't choose one direction or the other. We lay down a path of working. We restrict the role of the state and the possible oppressive nature of the state, which honestly the constitution didn't do enough, but it's a great stated intention. And therefore leave it to the people to decide whether they want to be socialist or capitalist or what they want to be. Instead, Indira Gandhi added those words to the preamble, and there is even a clause today that any political party which registers itself as a party in India has to pledge allegiance to the word socialism. And that is nonsense. Because if you and I were to start a party, which of course we never will, because we are thinkers and not doers. No, we are doers, but in a different way. But we are not political people in that way. So we would never start a party, but we would be unable to start a party because we'd have to pledge allegiance to socialism, which fundamentally goes against everything we believe in. So S.V. Raju, the late president of the Swatantra Party, in fact, fought in court for many years, and I forget if it was a losing battle, fought in court for many years to get this restriction removed, because he said that there is such cognitive dissonance. The Swatantra Party stands against socialism, and how can I, pledge allegiance to that? So that was a sort of a losing battle. Now, Ambedkar himself, even before that Constituent Assembly speech, had his doubts about socialism. In his great masterpiece of a book, The Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar wrote, "Can you have economic reform without first bringing about a reform of the social order?" And this is what he's saying to the socialists. They are saying reform the social order, bourgeoisie, proletariat, etc., etc. And Ambedkar is saying that no, you have to, society is a particular way. Reforming that doesn't change anything. And you will now go back to our earlier criticisms of Marxism, which we had cited by various people, Max Weber and Karl Popper, saying that, oh, everything is economics and that's not all that shapes society. And, equally you have other criticisms about, from the left itself, about how, everything is not just about class. It's so many other factors in play. In this case, caste, right? And Ambedkar kind of brings it up. And as you see later in his life, and again, Ambedkar has some more than 60 volumes, and we will link them from the show notes of his collected works, available for free to read online. Like two things which are available for free online, which are a priceless resource, are 99 volumes of Mahatma Gandhi's collected writings and some 60 plus volumes of B.R. Ambedkar's collected writings. They are free. This stuff is free, and it is amazing to read. And as you read it, you get a sense of the arc of his life and how his thinking evolved. So in the early 1950s, for example, he is much more for capitalism and pro-capitalism, partly because he sees the impact that they had on Dalit society, which is why Chandrabhan Prasad, much later, while pointing this out, he's a great Dalit scholar who's run an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with me, said that, his heroes are Ambedkar and Adam Smith. Eloquent words. But anyway, that's where that's how Ambedkar looked at it. And that's what really pisses me off, that, when the CAA protests were happening, the CAA was monstrous. I was against it vocally. And I was so delighted that young people across the country were going out in protest marches holding the preamble. But many of them were holding the wrong preamble. They were not holding Ambedkar's preamble. They were holding Indira's preamble, which has the word socialist in it. And I'm like, do you even know what it means? Socialist doesn't mean what is good for society. Please understand the implications. Socialism kept us poor for decades longer than necessary. In fact, large parts of this country are still like sub-Saharan Africa because of the legacy of those decades and how we haven't completely left it behind and how that thinking still persists. So please don't use that word. And of course, this is complicated by something you pointed out this morning, where we were thinking of the Hindi equivalent of socialist and liberal and all all of that. And the Hindi equivalent of socialist would be Samajwad, which doesn't carry these connotations of ownership, public ownership of property and all that. It just broadly means what is on the side of society, what is good for society. And in that sense, I am Samajwad. But when you use it as a proper noun in this sense, like, oh my God, we got to be careful.
Yeah. I was watching Ambedkar's response that it should be the game that the constitution sets in motion of rival political parties that leads to a program. And the outcome of that should not be coded upfront into the constitution. It's an intellectually correct argument. But I was also a little sad that he did not bring up the intimate connections between socialism and rights. That the only way to make a socialism is to crush individual rights. And that is antithetic to any concept of constitutional liberal democracy. That if you have a constitution, you take rights seriously. So rights to speech, right to property, right to life, all these things are fundamental to liberal democracy, and they don't go with the socialist program. It's a pity he didn't bring it up that way, and all of us need to understand these difficulties to a greater extent.
I'm going to object on behalf of Ambedkar and just gently point out two things. One thing I'll say that in those times, it is unfair to expect him to get everything right the way we would want in hindsight. History hadn't really played itself out. The Soviet Union still appeared to be a success, etc., etc. All our heroes, your heroes, Nehru and Keynes, heroes of mine as well, got so many things wrong. You can't get everything right, and it's unfair to judge a person's work in hindsight. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that Ambedkar was focusing on a social evil that was incredibly visceral to him, which was the evil of caste. And that occupied all of his, a lot of his intellectual attention and his cognitive faculties. And, focus there meant less focus somewhere else, which is bound to happen. And I would defend him by saying that the positive things that have come out of his thinking, and I know you agree with me, are just vastly outweigh the little omissions that might have happened.
And then communism.
So actually, so much of what we spoke about Marxism and socialism actually feeds into communism. So I'll keep it brief and I'll just go into the main maxims of communism. The main maxims of communism is that there is no private property at all, apart from individual possessions. I would presumably be allowed to hold my iPad, though I think the state could take it away at any time, except that there would be no iPad, because I would not be rich enough in a communist society to buy an iPad unless I was kind of running the show, and iPads would not be produced in a mass way. So, but leaving that aside, no private property at all. And then there is that maxim which Marx coined, I think in 1875, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Right? And so that was the idea, that everything is equal, and what you need you get, and what you are able to produce you produce, and it is just like an equal commune. And the world doesn't really work like that, and the world doesn't progress like that. Equality of outcome really means equality of poverty. Lessons of history, we already know that. And then there were other utopian aspects of it, like a classless society and all that, which never actually came about. But the point is, the moment you try to get to that destination, and the moment you have a society where the state owns everything, extreme violence is required. And we have seen the result of it in communist countries across the world, like the Soviet Union, like China, like Venezuela, and not modern China, Maoist China. But what Deng kind of did was a dictatorship with certain aspects of a market. So I would not, like a friend of mine told me the other day, but communism made China rich. And I'm like, no, markets made China rich to the extent that those markets were allowed. And it was a dictatorship, but that doesn't mean dictatorships are good. It was an outlier, and generally dictatorships work out badly, completely different subject. But so that's where I would sort of just like to sum up communism, that, it just ends so badly that with the lessons of history, for anyone to call themselves a communist today is an utter absurdity.
Where in this story did we get to one party rule and dictatorship? Meaning, could you square the circle? Could you imagine government ownership of all property, but the presence of a lively competition between multiple political parties. How do you get to Soviet Russia or Putin's Russia or China, which is one party rule, and the use of complete state cruelty and state oppression against opposition parties? That to be an opposition party is dangerous. You will get raided, you will get jailed. It is a terrible life to be an opposition party. How did that transition happen?
So that's a great question, and I'll just think out loud because I haven't spent time thinking about this. But thinking out loud, I'd say that once you decide that violence and coercion are an acceptable way to come to power, then they axiomatically become an acceptable way to stay in power. Once you talk about the overarching power of the state, then you are going to do anything you can to make sure you control the reins of the state. So ultimately, the logical conclusion is that you will have one party rule, because once you have power and you made the state so powerful that you can just lock up all your opponents, because that's the whole idea. You made the state that powerful, then why on earth would you give that power up?
Okay, let's go a little away from Marxism, socialism, communism to the delusion of many an intellectual in India, which is statism. Tell us what that means and how did that happen?
So let's talk about statism, and I was keen to have it as a chapter in this, both of us were. Even though it's not a political ideology by itself, it's not a separate political ideology, it's an attitude and a tool for many different ideologies. And the whole idea of statism is that everything will be run from the top down, right? And there's a great quote again by your favorite thinker, Adam Smith, which kind of sums this up. So let me read that out. I love this quote. The man of system is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely and in all its parts, without any regard either to the great interests or to the strong prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as a hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them, but that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. If those two principles coincide and act in the same direction, the game of human society will go on easily and harmoniously, and is very likely to be happy and successful. If they are opposite or different, the game will go on miserably, and the society must at all times be in the highest degree of disorder. Stop quote. So I love this analogy of a chessboard. You're arranging the pieces. When you and I play chess, we are in complete control of where our pieces are moving and what they are doing, and we have a plan, and the plan may come to fruition even if you're not 28, 30. But society is not like that. It is so deeply complicated. When you imagine you can control it, when you imagine you can run an economy without the magic spontaneous order of prices, which we spoke about in our 4 papers episode where we chatted about Hayek, that is just so delusional. And the classic illustration of this delusion that I keep going back to is from 1958, where Chairman Mao decided that something had to be done about sparrows. Right? Farmers were complaining that sparrows are bothering us and we got to do something about them, etc., etc. So thus began the Great Sparrow Purge. The state, headed by Chairman Mao, decided that he wanted to play a particular chess move on the chessboard of the world, and he argued that all sparrows should be put to death. And indeed, all across China, wherever they could catch sparrows, they killed the sparrows. Now, here's what happened. Sparrows played a role in the ecosystem. They ate locusts. Right? When the sparrows died out, the locusts proliferated and they destroyed all the crops of China. And then there was a great famine, and then 45 million people died, and this is known as a Great Leap Forward. This is what happened, and this is the folly of central planning, that society is too deeply complex. You can't control this shit. Again, the conservative warning that respect the complexity and don't try to meddle too much with it.
Okay, and what is libertarian and how is it different from liberal?
So, libertarian is a label with which people still use it for me, and I used to identify with it and use it for myself till I decided that, hey, I don't like labels, and I also don't like other libertarians because they're not libertarian. So, I just cast that label aside. But libertarian would basically be the same as classical liberal. Liberal in the old sense, you believe in individual freedom. Within libertarianism, there are these two schools of thought. One is anarchist libertarian, who believe that a state is not required at all, that society can regulate itself, norms are enough, and etc. etc. And then there are minarchist libertarians, which would include me, I guess, where you believe in a role for a limited government. That, hey, it's a liberal paradox to protect our rights, we need to give away some of them. You do need a state with a monopoly on violence, but it has to be like a night watchman state, and there have to be robust debates about what it can and cannot do, which take into account the violence that it inflicts, the subject of episode 25. And so most libertarians believe in a limited government, but are correctly suspicious of the damage that it can do. And I think when I think of this as a book, I'll recommend at the end of the episode by David Bose. But David Bose has one of my favorite quotes on this, which summed up the American political scenario, where he said, "Conservatives want to be your daddy, telling you what to do and what not to do. Liberals want to be your mommy, feeding you, tucking you in, and wiping your nose. Libertarians want to treat you as an adult." Stop quote. And I love that quote, and it also tells you how freedom is not respected on any side of the political divide. Our next chapter is going to be about left and right, but I'll take the liberty of using those terms now. And I will make a statement that if two consenting adults interact with each other in any way without harming anyone else, no one has a business getting in the way, right? But often in many countries, the conservative, in a bad sense, the conservative right will object at what you do in the bedroom, and the left will object to what you do in the marketplace. And I think that that is deeply, deeply incoherent, that, I value freedom in every single domain, which, also brings us to India, in fact, where people talk of left and right in India. I mean, we'll come to these terms in the next chapter, but in India, they make absolutely no sense. All our parties are left of center when it comes to economics, and right of center in the bad way when it comes to society. They are against freedom in the bedroom and in the marketplace. All our parties. And that just boggles my mind and just makes me so angry.
Was it the case that when the word liberal got messed up in America to convey some big state people, then the small state people said, that ain't me, and invented the word libertarian?
That's exactly how it happened. And I would think of many of the 20th century liberal thinkers we admire, in the good sense of the word liberal, like, Mises, Hayek, Friedman. They are also called libertarian by, I mean, they've sort of been described as libertarian as well. Hayek is, in a sense, one of the godfathers of the libertarian movement. And I understand that. But then the point is that terminology is always going to be a problem. Grifters took away the term liberal, and grifters are taking away the word libertarian, and it's just difficult. So when you engage in discussion, it is always useful that don't use labels for the other person. That is very reductive and also refers to all kinds of tribal baggage. Instead, talk about principles, talk about values, and more on the discourse a little later, but it's time to talk about left and right.
Okay, left and right.
Left and right. So the terms originated in the French National Assembly in the early part of the 19th century, where what happened is that one bunch of people sat on the left of the assembly and one bunch of people sat on the right of the assembly. And the ones who sat on the left were actually a lot like us, right? They wanted change. They were against the old feudal order. They were against monarchy. They wanted good things to happen, etc., etc. And the ones on the right were conservatives of the bad kind, that they wanted to preserve monarchy and they wanted to, preserve the stuff in society that needed changing. So the terms began to be used then. But obviously the meanings are vastly different. They morphed over time. And when we mean the left, what do we mean? Like, what is common to the left? And I don't think anyone from the left would, argue with me on this. They would say that these are features, not bugs. But the way that the left will think about the world is that they will look at the state as an instrument of change. So whatever outcomes that they want, whether it is to build a welfare society where everyone is looked after, whether it is to correct for inequality, etc., they will look at the state as an agent of that change, and therefore statism will be baked in. The coercion that comes along with that will be baked in, and their vision of the world will be that sort of zero-sum vision broadly. But my main objection to the left would be exactly that. And the left, when it comes to social issues, will mostly take positions that I agree with, right? Individual freedom in all aspects. But when it comes to the economy and society, society in terms of how it should be shaped or run or whatever, it will rely too much on state coercion, which is ironic because the original left, if you go back to the French Assembly, was against a monarch. It was against coercive power. It was against that oppressive behemoth. But then when they get a chance to come to power, they kind of take it over. And the right broadly is a package that includes conservatism of both kinds, the bad kind and the respect for complexity kind, and also respect for free markets. Because an economics and it goes in the other direction. Once you've seen the good that free markets do, you want to sort of preserve it. So, like there was a friend of mine, a friend of ours, a very dear friend of both of us, who on his Twitter bio used to say a proud right-winger. And he immediately took that off, I think about 11, 12 years ago, because the connotation of the word completely changed. And he is only a proud right-winger in terms of economics, supporting free markets and so on and so forth, but otherwise not. Now in India, I've already pointed out the dichotomy that actually all the parties are the same. They're left in the worst way, they're right in the worst way. And I don't like that. But if you look at what happened in America, what happened to the Republican and Democratic parties, one was broadly left, one was broadly right, is that there has been a derangement in both parties where both parties have sort of fallen in the thrall of dangerous cults which don't hew to the higher principles of both sides. Right? And that makes me very sad. And I have good friends on the left and I have good friends on the right who are silent, who are like, what the fuck even happened? I thought XYZ was on my side. They believed in my values. Now I find that they don't. So everything's gone to hell. That's a subject for another day, and perhaps it's not even a subject for us because, we have less skin in the game and may not be experts to that extent. But it's really interesting how this stuff works out.
Yeah. Earlier, I would have put an economic spin on left and right, where I would have said that the left cares more about inequality and the right cares more about growth. And you and I would have solidly supported the growth people, saying that distribution is not a very important problem. The really, really important thing is to get rich. But in the modern world, everything has got messed up. So you've got all kinds of anti-growth policies now emanating from what we would call the right. So Land Pritchett says that in every country there is an anti-growth coalition. And it used to be that they were all the lefties. But today, like, interfering in the working of the market, interfering in globalization is just all over the place. Okay, let's shift away from the more complex aspects of economics and state and turn to a simple thing. Tell me about nationalism, tell me about patriotism. They both sound alike to me.
Yeah, so, both of us, Ajay Shah, are people who love our country deeply. And we hate nationalism deeply. In fact, I think nationalism is anti-national, right? And why do I say that? I say that because I'm Bengali and Tagore said it, and I'll just quote him on that. But basically to kind of define them, that patriotism means you love your country, but nationalism means that you define a nation for yourself in a way that other people, right? That this is my tribe, that is another tribe, that tribe is the enemy, and you're playing to those basic tribal instincts which are hardwired into us. And many of our instincts we could amplify, but some we must mitigate, and this is one that we always should mitigate. Now, Tagore called nationalism a great menace. It was Tagore who said, it is a particular thing which for years has been at the bottom of India's troubles, right? Because he recognized what it could do. He recognized that the othering that happens with nationalism can tear society apart and is dangerous to all of us. Karl Popper famously said Nationalism appeals to our tribal instincts, to passion and to prejudice, and to our nostalgic desire to be relieved from the strain of individual responsibility, which it attempts to replace by a collective or group responsibility. This is in his great book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And you sort of see an Indian version of this nationalism, like just to make clear what I mean by othering and tribal thinking, I refer to Savarkar's book, What is Hindutva, which comes out in 1925, right? And which is a formulation that is still very much in vogue. I mean, Savarkar and the RSS did not see eye to eye on many things, and the Hindu Mahasabha went away. But a lot of the nationalist movement today kind of believes with that. And Savarkar was driven by antipathy towards Muslims and Christians, but not towards Jains and Hindus, Jains and Buddhists. So how could he possibly, justify this with a theory that made some kind of intellectual coherent sense that would be complete in and of itself if you accept the basic premise, right? And in fact, in an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with me, Shruti Kapila described Hindutva as a theory of violence in search of a history. And Savarkar made an attempt to give it a history and a theory. And Savarkar's formulation was this. He first attempted to define Hindu, and he said, you are a Hindu if both your homeland and your land of worship is India. And the moment you say both your homeland and your land of worship, you are counting out Christians and Muslims because your land of worship is allegedly somewhere else. And you are saying, okay, Jains and Buddhists are allowed there among us. You know, it's a very convenient formulation. In a way, it's a masterful formulation because he achieved his end. It is deeply, deeply toxic. And no one questions the premise that, okay, you said this, but why? Why should this formulation hold true? Why should this be a Hindu? You know, thousands of thinkers before you have defined it in very, very different and more inclusive ways. Bhai, aap kaun hote ho? But this is a kind of toxic nationalism. This is what I mean by the other. Integral to Savarkar's nationalistic vision is the othering of Muslims and Christians, right? And there are so few Christians in India that we don't really see this play out to that extent today. But the major fault line in our politics today is the othering of Muslims. And, this arises directly out of nationalism. Another man who, I call a friend, you met him a few times, you admire him, Ram Guha, had this to say about nationalism and patriotism. While a patriot strives to make his or her country a better place, a less violent place, a less poverty-ridden place, and a less exploitative place, a nationalist wants to bomb everybody else. He doesn't care how bad his own country is. Right. And this is exactly what is about Hindutva. In fact, I've done a couple of episodes of The Seen and the Unseen with Akar Patel. And in the first of them, he said that, look, here's the thing. If you look at other ideologies, you can tell what they are for. But Hindutva, tell me what it is for. I know what it is against. It is against Muslims and blah, blah, blah. What is it actually for? Right? And it's a very interesting hypothetical question, and dear readers, you might want to address it if you want to. I won't get into that argument here. And this is not a broadside against Hinduism. We have an early episode on that. We respect the cultures and the traditions, and but the nationalism, of which Hindutva is a manifestation, quite apart from the religion itself, is deeply toxic and deeply dangerous. I should also at this point out that there are people who have tried to give a different spin to the word and use it in a good way. Our dear friend Nitin Pai, both of us admire him a lot, talks about something called liberal nationalism. And this really disturbed me because I don't see how those two are really possible. So I had a full episode with Nitin, which you can check out, of The Seen and the Unseen, where we discussed this. And we argued a lot in that, but a good friend and a wonderful man and a great thinker. So maybe he's right and I'm wrong, but that is for you guys to judge and decide. And also a scholar called Yael Tamir wrote a book a few years ago called Why Nationalism? And Tamir makes an argument for it. And I wrote a review of that book, which I will link from the show notes. But I ended that review with something not about the book, but about nationalism in India. And I'll read that out for you, quoting myself for once, because hey, why not? Those who try to divide us, therefore, are the true anti-nationals. We must reclaim nationalism from them. And, maybe this can be Varma's sixth law, that if someone uses the term anti-nationals for others, they are the true anti-nationals, right? And so nationalism, deeply toxic, deeply dangerous. What are your thoughts, Ajay?
I've always thought that there was something beautiful going on in the way uh, Tagore and Gandhiji and Nehru, squared this circle that we are Indian, we are part of the world. There are some great achievements elsewhere in the world. We'll bring it all together. We're not going to be toxic in asserting that no, whatever is the old Indian tradition is somehow right, which is again a conservative instinct. Instead, I think they brought the idea of being open to ideas. So Gandhiji was deeply influenced by Tolstoy. Gandhiji took the Bible very seriously. He was interested in the Bible. He read the New Testament with great interest. And I thought that was a nice way to, like, can we all just get along? Can we make progress? Can we find a happy synthesis? I've always thought that nationalism in India stems from deep insecurity. That generally when I meet people who are very nationalistic, they are nervous deep inside about the weaknesses that are present inside India and the greatness of the advanced economies. So I've never been able to shake off this insecurity aspect from Indian nationalism. If you are actually strong, if you're actually capable, then you will relax. Then you will engage with others as equals. There'll be a happy and healthy give and take. When you start shunning foreigners, when you hate all foreigners, when you are hostile to others, when you start saying India is somehow exclusive and cut off and an enemy of everybody else and everybody else is here to harm us, I think that's not because that's your analytical reading of the world. I think it's because you're deeply insecure. So I've always felt that Indian nationalism is born of insecurity. Okay, Amit, we are at the end of all the big weighty terms freighted with history and emotion. Now give us a rapid fire short version of a bunch of stragglers.
So I would call them a bunch of straddlers. These are important political movements. You should kind of respect them and take them very seriously. But the broad stuff we've covered in this episode, so I'll just run through a few. Number one, progressives. Right, and progressivism is a movement that really came about in the late 1800s, and it was a reaction against the alleged excesses of runaway capitalism. So workers have bad conditions, and capitalists are doing this, capitalists are doing that, and it came about as a reaction to that. And early progressives, self-described progressives, are people like Theodore Roosevelt, Dubois, Woodrow Wilson in a different kind of sense. Theodore Roosevelt even left the Republican Party in 1912 and formed something called the Progressive Party. Didn't last very long, but he did that. And later on, progressivism, their means of achieving anything was obviously state power, state coercion. So it came to be identified with the left wing after the Great Depression happened. Franklin Roosevelt kind of took it over. So progressives and the American style liberals, the left wingers who believe in state intervention and everything and who are distrustful of markets, would describe themselves as progressives. The word got a revival in the late 1990s, and it got a revival from within the Democratic Party, because many people within the Democratic Party on the far left of the party looked at more moderate or centrist figures within the party and wanted to distinguish themselves from them. So Bill Clinton, for example, is a person who you and I would, in terms of his policies and his presidency, I think there's a lot to like there. He understood the power of markets, a very sensible man. One could say that his personal failing was he was too liberal with his affections, but leaving that aside, he was someone that the far left of the party also objected to for a variety of reasons, his friendliness to markets being one of them. So they would therefore describe themselves as progressives to show that, hey, we are in the Democratic Party, but we are this. But I view that term as broadly synonymous with the American sense of liberal, and that's who progressives are. Now, what about a more recent term, woke? Right? Woke arrived as a term that meant being awake to social injustice. There is injustice in society and you are woke to it, right? And that's what it originally meant, and that's a term that I'm really happy to embrace in its original meaning. But today it has come to have different connotations entirely. Now this is something that I could literally do a full episode on at some point in the future, after which I will get lynched and the show will end. So maybe that's well into the future. But I will just briefly say that I consider wokeism to be deeply illiberal, people often think of, liberal and woke as almost similar things. Oh, you care about people, you care about the downtrodden, you care about minorities. Actually, to me, wokeism begins where liberalism ends. Why? Because liberalism is about the individual, about individual agency, individual autonomy, individual freedom, and most important, respecting the complexity of every human being. Whereas wokeism is actually a successor to Marxism. Remember what Marxism does, where it divides the world into the oppressed and the oppressors. Only Marxism takes that one category of class. Wokeism takes it into a whole new dimension and says that there are many categories like that. Intersectionality also plays into it. There are many, many categories, and people in the woke worldview are defined by their identity of birth. You are either a victim or an oppressor. Sometimes you are both, depending on which identity you look at. And sometimes you have this Olympics of victimhood where people are competing to show who's a greater victim. And if you are a victim, that is it, that defines you. If you are an oppressor, that is it, that defines you, and there is no way out of that. And it's a kind of essentialism that I deplore. It is deeply disrespectful to humanity, because all of us are individuals, all of us contain multitudes, and I object to this strongly for that reason. I have 100 other objections to different facets of what I consider an ideological cult. And I think peak woke is behind us, and even the left in America has kind of woken up to what their fellow travelers have been up to. I had an absolutely openly left-wing academic on my show who I discussed this with. And at one point he said, look, don't ask me about this stuff on the show, because I will rant and rave off the record, but I'm a professor in a university in the USA. There are things I cannot say on the record. So leave that aside. Let's go past a book. But my broad feeling on it is that if you just apply the principle of, are you thinking in terms of individuals or are you thinking in terms of groups, that's a good prism to think about it. My next term is populism. Now, we have a full episode on this. I love the episode, so I will not even bother to define it. I will say that just go and look at the episode. But the important thing to note is that populism doesn't mean what is popular. It is a package of different beliefs and ways of operating, which are deeply dangerous. Populism is on the rise along with nationalism everywhere in the world, so we need to think about it deeply. We have skin in the game because we live in this world. So please watch that episode. There are other terms I won't really bother to go into in much detail. There's radical, there is reactionary, anarchism, there's neoliberal. Neoliberal is a pure cuss word used against people who are for markets. I once asked a guest on my show to, won't link that episode. It was slightly awkward sort of bit of conversation where she used the term neoliberal at the end of a really great episode, and I kind of challenged her on it, and she couldn't even define it. And it's just a vague kind of thing. It's a convenient pejorative term to use. And I'm like, no, please define the term, and then we can discuss it. But you can't just use it as a pejorative. It's a worse way to use a label. So whenever I hear someone use the term neoliberal, my mind kind of stops taking them seriously. That, okay, you've been brainwashed in some American university system or whatever. I live in the real world. Let's talk about that.
Okay, Amit. Now you have to worry about all our gentle readers who want to go deep into these things and understand them well. So show us a beautiful kit of readings that will carry this conversation forward.
So I'll name a bunch of books, many of which I have recommended on this show before, but they were fundamental in making me understand the world better, and I hope they'll do the same for you. And the first of them is called The Three Languages of Politics by Arnold Kling. Right, and Arnold Kling has also been on the scene and the unseen talking about this. And Kling's fundamental point in the book is that, look, our discourse has been destroyed today because of a fundamental problem. That we are not talking to each other, we are talking past each other. How are we talking past each other? Because what he defined as the three ideological tribes in the US, today there's a fourth, he talks about that in his episode with me, that's Trumpism, MAGAism, etc. But the three ideological tribes that are sort of in the US have different first principles. So progressives will come from a first principle of equality, libertarians will come from a first principle of freedom, conservatives will come from a first principle of tradition. And he will say that, therefore, if any two of these people are talking to each other, they are referring to their own first principles, not to the other side. It is, if you care about equality and I care about freedom, it is pointless for me to come to you and say you are wrong because freedom, 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 and vice versa. Instead, we have to appreciate the other person's values, recognize that those values are important. We should not denigrate them or diss them, but then speak on the basis of those values. So if I come to you and I'm a freedom guy and you're an equality guy, the good way to argue is to say that I recognize where you're coming from. These aims are supremely important. This is what we need. You want to reduce poverty, so do I, right? Let's talk about what will get us there. Let's look at the lessons of history, and I will try to convince her in that way, and she will try to convince me in her way, and therefore we can actually get somewhere. But you have to respect the other person's positions and their first principles, and then have that dialogue, and then minds can change and Bayesian updating can happen. So it's a beautiful book for that reason, and I recommend it. The next book I recommend is Communism by Richard Pipes. Richard Pipes is a great historian, has written a lot on communism, and this book that I'm recommending is a slim volume which takes you into the horrors of what really happened there. And after this, no doubt, you'll go into his other books, and people like Robert Conquest have also covered the subject in great detail. But it is worth reading to see the reality of what went down and connect the journey of ideas to action to consequences. So that's a great book. Then another great book I will name is The Libertarian Mind, a Manifesto for Freedom by David Bose. He's the one I quoted earlier on how libertarians want to treat you as an adult, a great thinker who died recently. He was on my show many years ago. We did a remote episode, 1 hour, where we spoke about libertarianism. A wonderful man, one of my modern heroes. Alas, by the time I visited DC last year, he had already passed away. Otherwise, I would have paid homage to him. Just a great thinker. Another great thinker who's still alive. And I'm scared of calling him on the seen and the unseen. I've never done this because to me, he is such a venerable figure that I don't know what I could possibly say before him. Is the great Thomas Sowell, who is now in his 90s. And there are many, many great books by him. I would just recommend, just check out all his books. Oh my God, what a thinker, right? And two books in particular which you could look at are A Conflict of Visions. And this is about how ideologies take shape and come into being and so on and so forth. And another great book is Economic Facts and Fallacies, which, from the time you start that book to the time you end that book, at least in my case, it made me such a clearer thinker about economics. So a really great writer for that reason. I would recommend everything by Milton Friedman, right? So I would recommend Capitalism and Freedom. I would recommend Free to Choose, co-written with Rose, his wife, and also the series Free to Choose. And there are 2 seasons of that, which are easy to watch on YouTube, and we will link them here, and you should check that out. I would recommend Friedrich Hayek, most particularly the paper that we spoke about in our episode on 4 papers that changed the world, the use of knowledge in society. Just like, oh my God, such light bulbs moment in that. It's a masterpiece. I'd recommend the collected works of Frederick Bastiat, the man who really turned me on to freedom. The title of my podcast, The Seen and the Unseen, comes from one of his essays, an absolute genius. And that's pretty much my list for the moment. And of course, all previous episodes of Everything is Everything, where we've spoken about this, episode 25 on the role of the state, episode 26 continues down that line, episode 10 on freedom. We have episodes on Hayek, we have episodes on Bastiat. Have we ever done an episode on Milton Friedman? Why on earth not? We should do one. And yeah, these are my recommendations. Do you have any, Ajay?
All good.